because this book, Capturing the Multiple Benefits of Energy Efficiency, was launched by the IEA in September 2014, but has continued to enjoy a huge amount of interest. So I'm glad to be able to reach this new audience today. It's an exciting project because energy efficiency continues to gain attention as a key resource globally. And as it does so, understanding its real value for economic and social development becomes increasingly important. So that's what led the IEA at the end of last year to launch this report. Essentially what it shows is that we've been dramatically understating the full benefit of energy efficiency investments. I was the project lead on the report, so I'm happy to be able to present some of the detail of what we found there to you. So let's get underway. So this is just an overview of what I'll be telling you. So I'm going to start with what drove the IEA to take this perspective on the multiple benefits of energy efficiency, the rationale that led to its development. Then I'll tell you a bit about some of the actual findings from the report. We looked at 5 key benefit areas. So I'll go through each of those and give you sort of a high-level overview of what came out of those. And then with the remaining time, I'll tell you a bit about what we think this means in terms of practical applications, how policies are going to actually policymakers are going to put this into practice. Right. So we know, of course, that energy efficiency has a key role to play in reducing carbon emissions. That tends to be one of the core drivers for energy efficiency policy in IEA member countries. And what you can see here on this slide is an IEA graph from the Energy Technology Perspectives work. And what it's tracking is the measures, the technologies that we would need to deploy between now and 2050 in order to comply with the international agreed standard of reducing carbon emissions to a level which would keep temperature rise below 2 degrees. So what you can see here is the red line at the top is business as usual, essentially, and what we expect is that we'll be looking at a 6-degree scenario out to 2050, and with the green line at the bottom being what we aim to achieve, 2-degree scenario, and the colours in between, all the technology deployment that will be needed in order to reach that goal. So what you can see as well is that energy efficiency has a really important role to play in that process and will be contributing about 40% of the emissions reductions that are needed to get there. There's another very important reason for doing energy efficiency though, and of course that is its potential to generate energy savings. So this graph on the slide here is from the IEA's Energy Efficiency Market Report, which many of you will probably be familiar with, from 2014. And here you can see that we estimated that energy efficiency in 2011 supplied about 1,300 MTOE to meet energy service demand in that year. And what's amazing is to see that that actually amounts to more than the supply of oil or electricity or natural gas in the countries that we covered. So a really strong message about the contribution that energy efficiency is making, that actually its contribution is greater than any other single fuel source. We also valued, I should say, the team that worked on it also valued the market for energy efficiency and pitched it at around $300 billion US. And that as well, that's the scale of the market. That market is comparable to any supply-side energy market. So big numbers, and what that led us to believe is that actually energy efficiency should no longer be treated as the hidden fuel. It's often called that because of its sort of intangible nature and its invisible nature as a negative energy value. But that actually we should start calling it the first fuel because of its contribution to the market, because of its contribution to energy demand, and because it's a domestic fuel, so it takes priority in that regard as well. So some other work of the IEA, this is all sort of the building blocks that led us in this direction of thinking. So and another important part of that work was the IEA's Efficient World scenario that was done in the World Energy Outlook in 2012. And that work looked at the cost effectiveness of energy efficiency investments from a range of perspectives. and it showed that the uptake of all economically viable energy efficiency investment, and they pitched that at around $12 trillion, has the potential to boost cumulative economic output through to 2035 by as much as $18 trillion. So that's a big number. That's, to give you a sense, that's larger than the economies of North America put together. And by North America, I mean Canada, the United States, and also Mexico. But significant contributions here. What's disappointing, though, is that the other thing that work revealed is that, as you can see on this slide, under the current policies, we expect only 1/3 of that potential to actually be realised out to 2035. So you can see there's a huge 2/3 of that potential is going to go unrealised, particularly in the building sector. You can see all 4 sectors there laid out on the slide. Now, we know that energy efficiency faces a range of different kinds of barriers, but our thinking was that in order to boost the uptake of these obviously valuable opportunities, what we really need to do is do a better job of explaining the importance of energy efficiency in terms of delivering real benefits in real terms, make it more concrete. And so that led us to the Multiple Benefits project. And you can see here our famous Multiple Benefits flower. Essentially, this work was aiming to dig deeper and go beyond these traditional measures of energy savings and carbon emissions reductions and explore a broader range of impacts from energy efficiency. And that these impacts have been shown to be potentially large and very valuable to economy and society, and just really haven't been understood properly to date. So you can see here, it's not an exhaustive list, but it's a fairly good range of the types of benefits that the literature has been showing up to date. And these include benefits to the energy system itself. You can see those in green. A host of economic benefits, macroeconomic benefits, but also benefits at different layers of the economy. Environmental benefits, of course, and then a range of social benefits. And it's those social benefits in particular that have been very poorly measured to date. So looking at these benefits, we realize that a lot of these have the potential to be even more valuable to society than the traditional conversation about energy savings. And this allows us to start doing what we realized we hadn't been doing before, which is to look at what energy efficiency is delivering in real terms. And as the executive director of the IEA was saying, to put a face on energy efficiency is really what we're trying to do. And I said that the benefits had been valued at around $18 trillion in 2035 in the WEO work. But of course, that number didn't take into account a full range of multiple benefits. And so we can assume from the numbers we've seen during the process of this multiple benefits work, we can assume that that number is probably significantly underestimating, believe it or not, the contribution that energy efficiency might be making on a global scale. So this is the study, which some of you may have already managed to get a copy of. Certainly I hope it's making the rounds. Essentially, the work was aimed to raise awareness of the concept of multiple benefits and start to broaden the discussion of energy efficiency, but also to drill down and try to increase the analytical substance that underpins the specific benefits we're talking about. So try to contribute to taking this discussion from a theoretical, sort of in the margins discussion, to something that can be concretely integrated into the mainstream assessment of energy efficiency policy impacts. So we spent about the last 2 years, doing an extensive collaborative research program. And we brought together cutting-edge research from a range of different disciplines, engaged with experts from around the world, and identified emerging best practice from those countries. And so we think this book offers the most comprehensive assessment of multiple benefits measures across the economy that's been done to date. And we think it's got the potential to transform the way we look at energy efficiency by taking us out of that old space of energy savings and carbon emissions reductions. So let's get into some of the detail. So I'll just come back to the multiple benefits flower to start us off. So I wanted to underline the fact that these benefits do occur can occur simultaneously and at different levels of the economy and for different stakeholders. So there's a lot of nuances that need to be captured if we're going to probably understand them. For example, asset values, that's a benefit that's going to be relevant only to the asset owner, so that's a personal benefit at one level, whereas an issue like improving the public budget balance is going to be an issue that's mostly relevant for public bodies. Of course, both of these have ripple effects across the economy, but then issues like effects on local air pollution or looking at the global macroeconomic impacts are going to be relevant to society as a whole. So when we were choosing the 5 benefits that we wanted to drill down on, we tried to take a cross-section of these types of benefits, and we chose 5 which we thought represented a sort of a fair cut of those. So we looked, see if I can make these come up. Yes, so macroeconomic impacts, of course, was a key one we looked at. We also looked at the public budget impacts on fiscal balance. We looked at health and well-being, which was a very interesting area and quite new for many of us in this space. Industrial productivity, which is a burgeoning area of work here, and of course energy delivery, which is sort of IEA bread and butter. But a lot of interesting new findings that were coming out in that space as well. Right, so to get into it, I'll start with macroeconomic impacts. This is where we began the book as well, because of course this benefit's really overarching one and represents the sum total of all of the impacts that would be happening at different levels of the economy. So what we found is that macroeconomic benefits are deriving mainly from 2 sources. The first would be from the impact of increased investment, so investment effects on the left-hand side. And that's essentially the impact of investment in energy efficiency goods and services and the impact of that flow of capital into the economy. And then on the other side is the impact of what happens when we actually get the energy efficiency improvement, when we actually make energy demand reductions, and the impact of the reallocation of those savings made, previously spent on energy, to more productive parts of the economy. And what we found, interestingly, is that it's usually safe to assume that it's going to be a positive macroeconomic effect from these dynamics, essentially because as the efficiency with which we're using resources improves, the outcome is always going to be positive. Of course, that depends on the particular trade balance and economic context of the country, and we're very careful to stress that the first step is for the policymakers in each country to make a preliminary assessment of whether this is going to come out positive, negative, before spending too many resources on doing a deep analysis of this. But what we found from looking at a range of studies that have been done was that there is going to be a positive impact in most cases, and that we can expect that to boost GDP growth, for example, by a factor of between 0.25% and 1.1%. So those numbers sound small, but of course in macroeconomic terms, pretty significant. And the key, of course, again, being that it is going to be positive. So what's interesting here again is that we're really moving away from the traditional view that energy performance is always linked to increased energy consumption, and realizing that the reverse can also be true. And this macroeconomic argument is a really interesting piece of research to get into. I certainly learned a lot, but it produces some really important arguments, particularly if we're having a conversation with Treasury departments and talking about justifying investment in energy efficiency policy. Just to go a little deeper on that for those of you who are interested in that. Now this is, I say deep, this is a fairly high level view on macroeconomic impacts, and that's because we're taking the assumption that the policymakers or the evaluators that are working on energy efficiency policy are not necessarily going to be economists and certainly not necessarily macroeconomists. So what we wanted to do is try and simplify this whole field and encourage energy efficiency analysts to venture into the space of at least doing preliminary assessments of whether there is some kind of macroeconomic impact at work here, and start the process of trying to understand what that might be. And so what we did is identified 4 key indicators that are the most popular ones being used in this area, and identified the kinds of components that would be needed to start to get a handle on those. So the 4 indicators were, well, the first is economic output at the top there, with GDP being the most common measure of a change in economic output. And of course that represents the total market value of all goods and services produced in a country. It's not a perfect measure of economic output, but it's certainly the one that we see most often, so easiest to relate to. Employment effects, another very important driver. So we'll be looking at the number of net new jobs created or lost as a result of your energy efficiency activity. And we can consider both direct and indirect jobs. Of course, measuring employment is a tricky field, and certainly there's no consensus approach for doing this. Of course, need to take into account a net job effect, so looking at the changes across sectors and try to consider the value of those jobs in terms of labour intensity and so on. Price effects, very important. If we assume that energy demand is going to drop, then we can expect to see a price effect on energy prices. Of course, you'd need a major demand drop to have an impact on global prices. But also we might be seeing some effects as a result of improving overall economic competitiveness. And finally, trade balance, which is talking about the nature and the amount of exports and imports and any change in that. So of course that means energy imports and exports, but also the import and export of energy efficiency goods and services. And quite interesting if we start to see a development of particular skills in an energy efficiency technology area. Right. Next we looked at public budgets. And by public budgets, you mean the budgets of cities, of public companies, and other subnational entities. There's a misperception in this area that energy efficiency programs fall exclusively on the cost side of budgets. And the reality is that these impacts actually have rarely been measured. This is sort of a general assumption more than anything. And when we did start to look at the studies, we found that using a multiple benefits approach, certainly, that this idea is definitely false, and that energy efficiency is offering significant returns on investment from the public sector. So again, as you can see here, we're looking at the same 2 effects driving those changes, those returns for national government, as for national governments. So on the one hand, we've got investment effects, and that's essentially the revenue from those investments. So for example, if we can expect to see more jobs created through that investment, then the revenues in terms of income tax take, or perhaps even lower unemployment payments, will have an impact for the public budget. And then once that energy saving is actually realised, the impact of energy savings, and we can see that just as simply as the impact of reducing public spending on energy itself in public buildings and so on. But also we can look as far as any reduction in spending on energy subsidies as energy demand goes down. And what was really a standout here was that if we start to apply a multiple benefits approach to looking at these effects from energy efficiency investment, we found that the numbers that are coming up can actually double. And just to give you an idea of that, take an example from a study that was done by Copenhagen Economics on the EU, where they were looking at the impact of the energy efficiency for buildings directive for the EU. And they calculated that an annual investment of $50 billion in the renovation of public buildings in Europe could create about 750,000 jobs each year out to 2020. And the basic assessment of those impacts showed a net annual improvement to the budget of around 40 billion. So coming close, but not quite meeting with the investment number. But then when they reran the numbers and applied a multiple benefits approach that took into some of these more complex dynamics around subsidies and income taxes, those figures more than doubled, and suddenly the return on that investment of 50 billion was around 90 billion US dollars. So what we can see essentially is that there is a huge amount of return that's happening in the economy but not being captured by the simple equations that are usually applied by the public sector. And as I say, these assessments are just simply not that often done. So we really advocate for a lot more work in the space and to apply the multiple benefits approach in doing so. Next, we looked at health impacts. This was a really interesting area. Obviously, it takes us a little bit outside of our area of expertise at the IEA, but we had the benefit of input from a lot of very experienced people in the medical sector. It was fairly new to us, but it is actually an area that's becoming increasingly well understood in several countries, certainly in particular in the countries that have got issues of fuel poverty to deal with. Because what we found is that these health impacts are most significant when energy efficiency is applied to low-income sectors of society. And of course, we hear increasingly about the health impacts of outdoor air pollution and in places like China and beyond. But what we wanted to do is focus in on the impact of indoor environments. Because it's easier to capture the impact of an energy efficiency measure on an individual home and creating a healthy indoor environment. So that's how we approached it in this book. And what we did is we wanted to understand the causal link between our energy efficiency measures and the health outcomes that were being claimed. So to do that, we broke the pathway down into exposure factors, being the conditions which lead to either positive or negative health outcomes. And then we looked at how energy efficiency measures can impact those exposure factors, the impacts that we know energy efficiency has on those conditions. And then that allowed us to draw the conclusions about the link between energy efficiency and those health outcomes. So you can see on this slide what we know about the link between exposure factors, so the indoor living conditions, and the negative or positive health outcomes that you can expect to see as a result. So we know that cold or even excessive heat actually in some cases will lead to cardiovascular problems and respiratory problems. Drafts as well, damp and in particular mold has a strong association with a lot of respiratory problem, arthritis and rheumatism, and also air quality. So we're talking about toxins from faulty or inefficient appliances, also things like radon in countries where that's present. And I wanted to just draw your attention to the impact on mental health in the bottom left corner there, particularly again in the context of low-income households or households in fuel poverty. What we saw is that there are significant mental health impacts, and positive impacts can be had if we can reduce chronic thermal discomfort and reduce the stress and the depression issues that come out of that. And some very compelling information showed up about that issue. So just to flip that around then, this is the positive loop where we can see energy efficiency measures having a positive impact on exposure factors and therefore health. So we're talking about the classic measures such as insulation, cleaner heating systems, replacing appliances with more efficient ones, and the results being that we make indoor environments warmer, drier, cleaner. And also in there is sense of control, which links back to that mental health issue, which, as I said, actually demonstrated some significant, valuable outcomes. So just to summarize that sort of exposure outcome pathway that we were looking at, you can see that there's this flow-on effect with energy efficiency ultimately driving some dramatic improvements in health and well-being of occupants of those homes. And on the end there is the potential to generate indirect social impacts. I wanted to draw attention to that. Although there is sort of still a real need for more robust and more detailed studies about the social impacts of energy efficiency, we did see examples of impacts such as improving productivity, educational attainment, even impacts on sort of social functioning of households and more broadly. But as I say, a lot more work is needed to really get a handle on those. And before I move on to the next benefit area, I just wanted to share a really interesting example with you that came from New Zealand, my home country actually. But Warm Up New Zealand was a really interesting program, really successful program that targeted retrofitting of insulation and clean heating systems to low-income homes. And they did a good job of targeting those measures, and then a really good job partnering with medical professionals of looking at the health and well-being impacts of that alongside the traditional measures of energy savings and GHG emissions. And the result was that the overall benefit cost ratio of that program rose up to $4 for every $1 invested. So that's a very satisfactory return rate. And what's even more interesting is that in that particular case, 99% of the benefits were health benefits. So obviously that's a huge percentage, and what we can see there is that there was a fairly significant rebound on the energy savings because these were low-income homes, and just a really significant impact on health improvements. There was some modelling on this done for the EU context as well, which is quite interesting. This looked at the value of these types of health benefits on the public budget. Of course, there is going to be a significant ramification at the public health spending level. And so that modelling, again by Copenhagen Economics, looked at a range of different energy efficiency scenarios. But even in the low energy efficiency scenario, they believed that we could be looking at savings of about $99 billion out to 2020 for European public health savings. So again, big numbers. And I wanted to draw your attention as well to this concept of warmth as medicine. So this was a powerful message that came out of the New Zealand work once again, and sort of really got to the heart of what energy efficiency is delivering. So that issue of making energy efficiency real, and was powerful enough to actually prick up the ears of the Ministry of Health, and did ultimately lead to cooperation between the Ministry of Health and the Energy Department that was administering that program. So a really brilliant result. Right, we'll leave health there, interesting as it is, and go on to the role of energy efficiency in boosting industrial productivity. Because we saw that energy efficiency can provide really valuable strategic benefits for industry. We categorized that, or we saw that they had been categorized in various ways, but particularly liked these 5 groups that I've put up on the slide here. So we're categorizing the kinds of outcomes into impacts on improving competitiveness, improving the cost effectiveness of production, reducing operations and maintenance costs, even things like improving the working environment for employees, health and safety, productivity of employees, and so on, and then also environmental benefits. So that is specifically reducing the cost of compliance with environmental standards and so on. And what we found is that the value of these types of benefits to industrial operations can be as much as 2.5 times the value of energy savings. So again, there's a scale of value that is generally going missed by the usual calculations done by energy managers in industry. And it's really interesting to start taking this perspective on energy efficiency because it demonstrates the impact that they have on business process and productivity, and actually strengthens the business case for energy efficiency investments. Often energy efficiency is a pretty low priority activity around boardrooms, but when we start to talk about creating value, improving competitiveness, improving profit margins, those are the kind of issues that make it into boardrooms and starts to push energy efficiency up the agenda in those investment discussions. Of course, the other important argument around this in this space is that an energy efficiency evaluation that takes into account all these dynamics is going to provide better information to shareholders and executives about their investment decisions they're making. So an example that we found here showed that, so obviously there are big impacts, big gains to be made in the energy intensive sectors, but even small businesses have a lot to gain. We saw an example from Peru actually, a secondary lead producer in Peru, who was doing a series of production component replacements and measured the impacts of those. Of course, calculated the energy cost saving. That came out at about 2,000 US dollars per annum. And then looked at just a simple calculation of the associated increase in production that energy efficiency improvement delivered. And that came out at almost $17,000. So that's about 10 times higher than the energy cost saving. So a really compelling reason to spend the time to go a little bit further and dig out those results. This area, though, is one where there are very few results to date. The work in this area has been scaling up fast, so we're looking forward to seeing a lot more numbers come out in this space. But I think this will be something that we'll want to circle back on in a year or two, and hopefully we'll have honed our ability to really capture some of these benefits in this space. Finally, we looked at energy delivery, which is more a bread and butter space for the IEA. And what we were looking at is the impact that energy efficiency programs can have for energy providers, so electricity or gas utilities, when they are delivering energy efficiency to their customers or in their own processes. And we've seen examples from all around the world showing that energy efficiency measures are going to reduce operating costs and improve profit margins. You can see on this slide on the right-hand side the range of types of benefits that have been calculated. And you can see, of course, that they're significantly outweighing the cost factor here. In particular, we saw that energy efficiency measures tend to lead to the deferral of new infrastructure investment, and that in 1 out of 3 cases, actually, those investments can be completely avoided. So huge savings in terms of generation capacity for energy providers. We looked at both the benefits for utilities in terms of cost and process savings, line losses, and all the issues you can see here on the slide. But we also wanted to look at the benefits for consumers, partly because regulatory bodies often require an assessment of that as well, but also because these are just key reasons for energy companies to be doing energy efficiency, and also have kickbacks in a circular fashion for the utility again, because if a utility is offering a better level of service to their customers and perhaps lowering energy bills on one level, can expect to see a drop in defaults on energy bills, improvements in debt collection, better customer relations, and a whole range of benefits related to the customer-utility relationship, as well as obviously the quantified value of those improvements in health or fuel savings that happen at the customer end. Now, of course, there's always a sort of ideological challenge when talking about energy efficiency measures by utilities, but we can see that this energy efficiency is actually opening up a new kind of business for energy providers. So decoupling the business model from unit sales of energy, and starting to look at energy service provider models. And a lot of the evidence in this space came from the US. I think there's a lot of people from the US on the call, and of course the US is where the regulatory context requires that a lot of analysis goes into the outcomes of energy efficiency obligations. So a lot of expertise has been building up in the US over the years, and we had the benefit of inputs from some very experienced experts in the US, as well as from Europe, and sharing with us the experience on the European context as well. So this is an area where the methodologies are fairly well developed, but there is still a challenge in this space as well, and that is the same challenge as in the other areas, which is around finding effective methods to measure some of these harder to measure, more intangible outcomes. And in particular, how to build those more societal benefits into cost effectiveness assessments in a robust way. There is a lot of progress being made on this, but we're watching to see what will happen, particularly in the US context, as cost effectiveness tests may start to change. Okay, so that is a sort of overview of the 5 areas of benefit that we covered in the book. Now I'm going to drill down on some sort of, what does this mean for policymakers in practice? Oh, but before I do, I thought I would throw in this just for a bit of a breather. I'll give you a second to read this. It's just a funny slide. I find it sort of hilarious. Maybe that's just me. It's not directly related to multiple benefits, but it does show the idea of, there's not just one outcome and that we need to take a broader perspective when we're thinking about what we're achieving with different policies. And of course, the economic crisis in many OECD countries means that there's a lot more at stake now. There's issues around improving economic growth more generally are really key. And multiple benefits does go towards that green growth type of perspective, captures the idea that there's more going on than meets the eye and that we should be taking that into account. Anyway, bit of light refreshment. Now back into something a bit more concrete. So I said at the beginning that we were looking to build the analytical substance around some of these benefits, and we really wanted to look at the methodologies that had been used in studies to date doing multiple benefits and see if we could help bring the field forward by sharing some of the most successful approaches that have been used. But to start with, what we would argue is that we need to start applying a multiple benefits approach to the whole policy development process. And so that has implications across the whole process from the planning stages in terms of setting objectives, and the first point on the slide refers to that. So the need to, at that policy planning stage, you need to think about a broader range of potential outcomes from your energy efficiency policy. And this is key because, of course, we've talked about a whole range of benefits, and certainly the multiple benefits flower shows a whole range of benefits. But only a few of those are going to be realistically achieved by any one policy, and good policy design would require that a policymaker decides on which are the priorities based on national, economic, social circumstances, and target just a couple in order to really have a bigger impact. So that at the planning stage, there's obviously implications for implementation, the way that you design your policy, and also in particular for the way you're going to monitor and evaluate the outcomes, the kinds of indicators you set out to measure. And the idea being that we're going to need to start measuring a broader range or different range of indicators in order to capture this broader set of outcomes. Now, a major barrier to the multiple benefits approach has been the seemingly intangible nature of a lot of these benefits and this perceived difficulty of being able to measure them in a reliable way. And so we did include a companion guide in this book which tries to present some of the successful measures that have been used in studies to date. And we found some very robust ways and some very innovative ways that have been used to measure some of these benefits and even the more intangible ones. And on the slide here, a couple of key messages that came out of that. One was the need to broaden the range of stakeholders that energy efficiency experts are engaging in this process, and also engaging community level experts. And then what we found to our delight was that there's not necessarily a need for a whole new range of tools, developing brand new ways of doing things. Actually, existing methods already exist that can be adapted quite effectively to capture some of the harder to measure benefits. And so in the companion guide to the book, some pointers on the types of things that have been done in that space are included. And of course that leads us to the third one, which is that it's really important to build consensus on these methods so that we can share the results of studies more effectively. As we're designing new and adapted ways of measuring benefits, it's useful to apply a similar style so that we can share that data and hopefully move the whole field forward more effectively. I'll leave that there for now. I wanted to talk about the rebound effect. Of course, we can never talk about energy efficiency without talking about the rebound effect. But actually, the multiple benefits approach has a really interesting message about rebound. It's always important to consider it, especially if we're thinking about the role of energy efficiency increasing economic activity. But what we found in the multiple benefits approach is that we actually need to move beyond the perception that the rebound effect is always going to be negative. It's often perceived as negative, but we can actually flip that around and say that the rebound effect is actually an indicator of a positive macroeconomic impact. It's actually an indicator of increased economic activity, and in most cases, in some cases, that might represent positive economic growth or improvements that policymakers are actually seeking. And I think the multiple benefits approach provides a clear understanding of the rebound effect. It enables you to unpack the rebound effect, understand what it represents in real terms. And actually this table is designed to help us do that and to illustrate the point that the significance of the rebound effect in each case is going to depend on the type of benefit you're actually after. So some benefits do depend on energy savings. So we're talking about, if we're simply talking about reducing energy demand, or if we're looking at outcomes like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, then obviously the rebound effect is going to diminish our achievement of those benefits. So that assessment of the rebound effect at the outset is always going to be key there, and particularly in these types of benefits. And these benefits are the ones with a Y across this top line. But there are other benefits that actually come with the energy consumption price tag. For example, health and well-being. So these types of benefits usually can be seen to drive a rebound effect. So our first reaction is that that's a negative outcome, but we actually need to decide whether that outcome is negative or positive. Certainly in the example of health and well-being, if we're looking at a poor family, a low-income family, that is, as a result of energy efficiency measures, is going to save money on heating bills. They've got two choices. They've got money to spend either on, they could save that money, but they could also spend that new money on investing in other energy-using equipment like a home computer, or they might decide just to keep their heating at the same level and not take any saving. That's where we're going to see a rebound effect. Maybe investment in a home computer will drive a rebound effect too. But the question is, if we've got a family who now has access to the internet and increased educational and productivity opportunities, or if we've just got a family that's warmer and healthier in their home, that's not necessarily a negative outcome, and it's for the policymaker to understand those dynamics and to make a decision as to whether that outcome is good enough to override the potentially negative suggestion of the rebound effect or not. Essentially, the multiple benefits approach encourages the evaluator to gather as much information as possible so that the policymaker can make that decision in an informed way. So, of course, it's always going to be important to, going to be critical to understand the rebound effect, but we need to do that in a more thoughtful way. And of course, it's worth mentioning in a developing country context, when we talk to colleagues from developing countries, they're actually eager to see energy savings channeled back into the economy. They want to see greater growth as a result. So in that case, the rebound effect starts to look more like an accelerator than as a brake. And we should start to think about it that way too. That brings me to the end of my presentation, more or less. I guess I'll finish just by giving you a few key messages. I've been going on a long time. But essentially, what we're saying with this work is that we need to do a better job of understanding what happens when energy efficiency improves. And there are two reasons for this. One is that we're going to be able to, we're going to enable policymakers to design better policies that maximize the benefits they're seeking and avoid the undesirable outcomes. And secondly, hopefully this will actually make a stronger case for investment in energy efficiency, and we can expect to see a greater uptake of those energy efficiency opportunities I mentioned at the beginning, and perhaps even a better appreciation by the public of what energy efficiency is all about and what they stand to gain from it. But essentially, this is just the beginning. We still need a lot more data. We need a lot more research and case studies done and to hone these methodologies further, and we certainly need a lot more discussion of the issues. Perhaps I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be keen to hear some feedback or any questions you might have.